In June 1846, in the London district of Clerkenwell, a sewer worker was going about an entirely ordinary night shift when the ground around him began to behave in a way that ordinary ground is not supposed to behave. A build-up of gas and pressure inside the old brick culvert beneath the streets gave way all at once, and a wall of filthy water burst upward through the road surface with enough force to lift paving stones into the air. Houses nearby shook, cellars flooded within seconds. For a few chaotic minutes, a river that most people living directly above it did not know existed reasserted itself in the middle of one of the largest cities on earth, just to remind everyone that it was still there. That river was called the Fleet. It still runs beneath London today in the dark, in a brick tunnel carrying the same water it always carried toward the same stretch of the Thames it has reached for longer than London has been a city at all. Most of the millions of people who cross its buried path every day on their way to work have absolutely no idea it is under their feet. Tonight, we are going down to find it, and the other rivers like it, the ones London swallowed rather than lost. If you are new here, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from tonight. Somewhere beneath a city street. If you could stand still on a quiet corner in central London in the small hours of the morning, when the traffic finally thins and the buses stop rattling the manhole covers and you pressed your hand flat against the pavement, in a small number of very specific places you would feel something, not a heartbeat exactly, but something with a similar rhythm, a faint cold vibration that has nothing to do with the underground trains running somewhere nearby. It is water, moving water, flowing in the dark inside a brick tunnel that was built before your great-great-grandparents were born, following a course that was cut by nature millions of years before that tunnel was ever built. London is a city that likes to believe it knows itself completely. It has been mapped and remapped for 2,000 years. Every street has a name, and most of the names have a history that somebody somewhere has written down. But underneath that legible, catalogued, endlessly photographed surface, there is a hydrology that the city spent nearly 3 centuries trying to erase, and largely succeeded in erasing from public memory without ever actually managing to make the water go away. London was built quite simply on a river valley riddled with smaller river valleys. The Thames is the obvious one, the one everybody can see, the one with bridges and boats and postcards. But feeding into it, on both the north and south banks, there were once a dozen or more tributary rivers of real size, rivers with their own names, their own mills, their own fish, their own communities settled along their banks for the same reasons any community settles beside fresh water anywhere in the world. As London grew from a Roman trading post into a medieval city, and then into an industrial metropolis of millions, those rivers became, one by one, a problem. They flooded, they silted up, and as the city's population exploded in the 18th and 19th centuries, they became something far worse than a problem. They became open sewers, carrying the waste of a rapidly growing population directly through the middle of neighborhoods where people lived, worked, and drew their drinking water. The solution that Victorian engineers eventually settled on was not to fix the rivers. It was to bury them, brick them over, roof them in, fold them into the ever-expanding sewer network, and let the surface of the city simply grow across the top of them, as though they had never existed at all. They very nearly succeeded. If you walk through central London today with no prior knowledge of what lies beneath your feet, you will see no sign that an entire hidden river network exists there at all. And yet it does. Every single one of London's lost rivers is still flowing right now, as you listen to this, carrying rainwater and groundwater through brick culverts that in some cases are well over a century and a half old, in a handful of cases considerably older than that, toward outfalls that still discharge into the Thames in more or less the same places their natural mouths always were. The rivers were never actually destroyed, they were only hidden. And the story of how and why that happened, and what still occasionally goes wrong when a hidden river decides to remind the city above it that it is still there, is what we are going to spend tonight exploring. The River Fleet, we begin with the largest and the most storied of London's buried rivers, the one that gives its name to Fleet Street, one of the most famous addresses in the English-speaking world, home for centuries to the British newspaper industry, and named for a river that most of the journalists who worked there for generations never once saw, because it had already vanished beneath their feet before most of them were born. The Fleet rises from two separate springs on Hampstead Heath, in North London, high ground that remains one of the city's last significant expanses of open parkland. In its natural state, the Fleet ran south for roughly 6 kilometers, gathering strength as it moved, cutting a valley that is still faintly visible in the topography of the city today, if you know where to look for it, through Kentish Town, Camden and King's Cross, before curving down through Clerkenwell and Farringdon, and finally reaching the Thames at Blackfriars. In the Roman and medieval periods, the Fleet was a genuinely significant waterway, wide enough and deep enough to be navigable by boat for a considerable distance upstream from the Thames. Wharves lined its lower reaches. Goods were unloaded directly from river barges within a short walk of where Ludgate Circus now sits, one of the busiest traffic junctions in the city. The Fleet Prison, a notorious institution that held debtors and various categories of prisoner for over 4 centuries, took its name directly from the river it stood beside, and the prison's proximity to the water was not incidental. Waste, quite simply, went into the Fleet, and the Fleet carried it away, which was precisely the arrangement that would eventually doom the river to centuries of increasing pollution. By the 17th century, contemporary accounts of the Fleet had already turned from admiration to disgust. Descriptions from the period describe a waterway thick with the discharge of slaughterhouses, tanneries, and the general refuse of a densely packed city, a river that had become, in the words of observers at the time, more ditch than watercourse. Following the Great Fire of London in 1666, the diarist and architect Sir Christopher Wren proposed rebuilding sections of the Fleet as an elegant canal in the Dutch style, lined with quays and warehouses, and for a period this vision was partially realized. It did not last. The canal silted up, fell into disrepair, and by the early 18th century had reverted to an open, filthy channel that the city increasingly regarded as an embarrassment rather than an asset. The burying of the Fleet did not happen all at once. It happened in stages over roughly a century and a half as different sections of the river were progressively covered, culverted, and absorbed into London's expanding sewer infrastructure. The upper reaches near Hampstead and Kentish Town were covered relatively early, folded into local drainage schemes as those areas urbanized. The middle sections through Camden and King's Cross followed as the railway age arrived, and the construction of major stations required the ground above and around the river to be stabilized and built upon. The final major section, through Clerkenwell and down to the Thames, was enclosed as part of the great Victorian sewer building project overseen by the engineer Sir Joseph Bazalgette in the 1860s, a scheme built directly in response to the public health catastrophe of the Great Stink of 1858, when the stench of the polluted Thames and its tributaries became so severe that sittings of Parliament itself had to be suspended. What survives today is remarkable in scale. The Fleet Sewer, as it is now formally known, is one of the largest of London's so-called interceptor and relief sewers, a brick-lined tunnel in places large enough for a person to walk through comfortably while standing upright, still following, with only minor deviations the exact natural course the river cut through the London clay over thousands of years before the city existed at all. It still carries genuine river water, rainwater runoff, and groundwater from Hampstead Springs, mixed now with the wastewater of the modern sewer network, down to a combined sewer overflow structure near Blackfriars Bridge, from which during periods of heavy rain, when the system is overwhelmed, it still occasionally discharges directly into the Thames, the same outfall point the natural river used for longer than written history can account for. The 1846 explosion in Clerkenwell that we opened with tonight was not, as it happens, an isolated incident. Gas accumulation from decomposing sewage, combined with the pressure of heavy rainfall funneling an enormous volume of water into a confined brick tunnel, has caused multiple documented ruptures, and near ruptures of the Fleet sewer across the 19th and 20th centuries. In each case, the pattern is essentially the same. A period of heavy rain overwhelms the tunnel's capacity, pressure builds somewhere along its considerable length, and for a brief, alarming period, a river that London spent a century and a half trying to make disappear reminds the surface above it quite forcefully that it never actually left. The Walbrook, if the Fleet is London's largest lost river, the Walbrook is arguably its most historically significant, despite being considerably smaller in scale. The Walbrook ran a short course, no more than a few kilometres from marshy ground north of the old Roman and medieval city wall, directly through the heart of what is now the financial district of the City of London, before joining the Thames near what is today Cannon Street Station. What makes the Walbrook remarkable is not its size, but what has been found buried along its banks. The stream effectively divided Roman Londinium into two halves, and its valley, low-lying and consistently waterlogged, has preserved organic material and archaeological deposits in a condition that drier sites elsewhere in the city simply cannot match. Roman leather goods, wooden writing tablets with legible ink still on their surfaces, coins, pottery and personal items have all been recovered from the Walbrook's ancient mud in a state of preservation that has repeatedly startled archaeologists working on construction sites in the area. The most famous discovery associated with the Walbrook is the Temple of Mithras, a Roman religious structure dedicated to a mystery cult imported from the Eastern Mediterranean, uncovered during construction work in 1954, directly on the banks of the buried stream. The temple's location was not accidental. Mithraic worship, along with a number of other Roman religious practices, held a particular association with underground and liminal spaces, and the marshy, secluded valley of the Walbrook, tucked away from the main civic centre of the Roman city, appears to have made it an attractive location for a cult that valued secrecy and initiation. The temple has since been relocated and can be visited today, reconstructed close to its original site, an experience that puts a visitor almost directly above a stream that has not seen open sky in that location for centuries. The Walbrook was one of the earliest of London's rivers to be lost, culverted piecemeal from as early as the 15th century as the City of London's medieval authorities grew increasingly frustrated with a watercourse that flooded unpredictably and had become, much like the Fleet, an open channel for waste in an increasingly crowded urban centre. By the 16th century, most of its course through the city had already vanished beneath the streets, making it one of the longest continuously buried rivers in the world, hidden from public view for the better part of 500 years before archaeologists and engineers began seriously reconstructing its exact route in the 20th century. The Tyburn west of the Fleet and the Walbrook, a third significant river, the Tyburn rose in the hills of Hampstead and ran south through what is now some of the most expensive real estate on the planet, past the site of Buckingham Palace and into the Thames near where the Palace of Westminster now stands. The Tyburn's name survives in the historical record for a reason that has nothing directly to do with the river itself. The village of Tyburn, which stood near the river's course, close to what is now Marble Arch, gave its name to London's principal site of public execution for roughly 6 centuries. The gallows known simply as Tyburn Tree, where tens of thousands of executions were carried out before the practice was relocated to Newgate in the late 18th century. The river and the gallows shared a name purely through geographic coincidence, but the association has left the word Tyburn carrying a weight in the historical imagination that the modest, largely forgotten stream itself never really earned on its own merits. What makes the Tyburn genuinely remarkable today is the degree to which it survives, quite literally, underneath one of the most recognizable buildings in the world. Engineering surveys and maintenance records associated with Buckingham Palace confirm that a branch of the old Tyburn still flows beneath the palace grounds, and the palace's basement areas have required specific engineering measures over the years to manage groundwater and drainage arising directly from the buried stream's continued presence. It is a curious thought to sit with that beneath the ceremonial heart of the British monarchy in the dark, a river that predates the monarchy by thousands of years, continues to run exactly where it always has, entirely indifferent to what has been built on top of it. The Effra south of the river, on the other side of the Thames, the Effra rose in the hills around Norwood and ran north through Brixton and Kennington before reaching the Thames near Vauxhall. Unlike the Fleet or the Walbrook, the Effra remained a relatively visible feature of the landscape well into the 19th century, and its burial came comparatively late as part of the same wave of Bazalgette-era sewer construction that finally enclosed the last open stretches of the Fleet. The Effra has developed something of a modern reputation among London's community of urban explorers and drainage enthusiasts for periodically making its continued existence felt in ways the Victorian engineers who buried it would probably have found frustrating. Flooding events in the areas the Effra once ran through, particularly around Herne Hill and Brixton, have recurred throughout the 20th and 21st centuries during periods of unusually heavy rainfall, and in more than one documented case, the flooding has been traced directly to the old river's buried culvert, reaching the limit of its Victorian-era capacity, a capacity engineered for a much smaller and less densely built city than the one that now sits above it. The Neckinger further east, south of the river in Bermondsey, a smaller and considerably stranger-named stream once ran to the Thames. The Neckinger's name is generally understood by historians to derive from an old term associated with a hangman's noose, and local tradition connects the name to the area's historical use for the execution of river pirates, whose bodies were reportedly left displayed near the water as a warning to others. Whether the etymology is entirely accurate is a matter some historians treat with a degree of caution, since place name origins of this kind often accumulate embellishment over the centuries in the retelling. But the name has stuck regardless, attached now permanently to a river most Londoners have never heard of, running beneath a district many of them pass through every day. The Westbourne, perhaps the single most visually striking piece of evidence for London's buried river network, sits in plain view for anyone who happens to be standing on the right platform at the right moment. The Westbourne rises in Hampstead, runs south through Kilburn and Bayswater, feeds the lake in Hyde Park known as the Serpentine, and continues south toward the Thames at Chelsea. For most of its course, the Westbourne is entirely hidden, buried and culverted like its counterparts elsewhere in the city. But at Sloane Square Underground Station, engineers in the 19th century, faced with the practical problem of a live river crossing directly over the path of a new railway tunnel, made a decision that has left an oddly visible scar in the fabric of the modern city. Rather than diverting the river or burying it more deeply, they built a large iron pipe and carried the Westbourne directly across the station, suspended above the platforms in plain sight of anyone waiting for a train. It remains there today, a wide, riveted iron conduit running directly overhead, and generations of London commuters have stood beneath it, waiting for the Circle or District line, without necessarily registering that the pipe above their heads carries a genuine river, one that has been flowing continuously since long before the railway, the station, or the city itself existed in anything like their current form. What the Victorians actually built it is worth pausing here to give proper credit to the scale of the engineering achievement that buried London's rivers, because understanding it changes the character of the mystery we are exploring tonight. This was not haphazard concealment. Sir Joseph Bazalgette's mid-19th century sewer network, built in direct response to the public health emergency of the Great Stink, remains one of the most significant civil engineering projects of the Victorian era anywhere in the world. Over the course of roughly a decade, more than 100 kilometers of new main sewers were constructed beneath London, many of them incorporating the existing courses of the city's natural rivers as the most efficient available channels for the new system, since those rivers already followed the lowest points in the local topography, exactly where gravity-fed sewage needed to flow. Bazalgette's tunnels were famously built to a far larger capacity than contemporary population estimates strictly required, a decision that has often been retold as an act of remarkable foresight, sometimes attributed to Bazalgette doubling his calculated figures simply to be safe. Whatever the precise reasoning, the oversizing proved fortunate because it allowed the network, including the buried rivers folded into it, to continue functioning for a London whose population would grow far beyond anything the original planners could have confidently predicted. That said, oversized is not the same as infinite, and London's population and paved surface area have both grown so substantially since the Victorian era that the same network, buried rivers included, now operates far closer to its limits than it did a century and a half ago, which is precisely why flooding incidents along the old river courses have become, if anything, slightly more frequent in recent decades rather than less. What still goes wrong, the recurring theme across nearly every one of London's buried rivers, is this: they were never actually eliminated, they were redirected, enclosed and built over, and for the overwhelming majority of the time, that arrangement works exactly as intended, invisibly and without incident. But every one of these rivers still carries real water, sourced from genuine springs and genuine rainfall catchments that have not gone anywhere in the intervening centuries. And every one of the Victorian tunnels built to contain that water was engineered according to the rainfall patterns and paved surface area of a 19th century city, not a 21st century one. Modern London has paved over vastly more of its natural absorbent ground than existed in Bazalgette's era, meaning a larger proportion of any given rainfall now runs off directly into the drainage network rather than soaking into soil first, arriving in the buried rivers faster and in greater volume than the Victorian engineers who sized those tunnels could have anticipated. Combine that with the increasing frequency of intense, short-duration rainfall events associated with a changing climate, and the result is a genuinely modern engineering challenge sitting on top of a genuinely historic piece of infrastructure. Flooding incidents in areas overlying the old courses of the Fleet, the Effra, and several of London's other buried rivers have been documented with increasing regularity in recent decades, and in nearly every case, hydrologists investigating the cause have confirmed the same underlying story. It is not new water appearing from nowhere. It is old rivers following courses they have followed for longer than the city itself has existed, occasionally reasserting a capacity that Victorian brick and modern London's expectations no longer comfortably agree on. The rivers we have not fully mapped here. The story shifts from settled history into something closer to the genuine uncertainty that runs through so much of London's underground. The major rivers, the Fleet, the Walbrook, the Tyburn, the Effra and the Westbourne, are relatively well documented, their historical courses reconstructed with reasonable confidence from a combination of old maps, place names, archaeological evidence, and the physical routes of the modern sewers that replaced them. But London's hydrology beneath the surface is considerably more complicated than 5 named rivers would suggest. Engineers and historians researching the city's buried watercourses have repeatedly noted the existence of smaller, unnamed or poorly documented streams and springs that do not correspond neatly to the handful of famous rivers that dominate popular accounts of the subject. Construction projects in London continue on a fairly regular basis to encounter groundwater flows, old brick culverts and buried channels that do not appear on any existing map of the historic river network, forcing archaeologists and engineers to reconstruct, after the fact, a piece of hydrological history that nobody had previously recorded in any surviving document. In several cases, the origin and full course of these minor buried streams has never been fully established, simply because doing so would require a level of investigation that no construction project has had the time, budget, or specific reason to undertake. This is, in its way, a very similar situation to the one we have encountered elsewhere in Britain's underground. A city that appears, on the surface, to be completely known and completely mapped, sits above a hydrological landscape that remains genuinely incomplete in the historical and engineering record. Not because the water itself is mysterious in any supernatural sense, but because centuries of piecemeal urban development, inconsistent record-keeping, and the sheer difficulty of investigating what lies beneath a continuously occupied, densely built modern city have left real gaps in what we can confidently say we know, the human relationship with the water below. There is a particular quality to London's relationship with its buried rivers that is worth sitting with for a moment before we begin to draw tonight's journey to a close. For nearly 200 years, the deliberate civic project was forgetting. Street names were changed. New buildings were constructed directly on top of old riverbeds with no surface acknowledgement of what lay beneath. Generations of Londoners were raised in a city that actively worked to erase the memory of its own hydrology, treating the rivers not as a heritage to be preserved, but as an embarrassment to be buried and, ideally, forgotten entirely. And yet the names persisted anyway, stubbornly, in a way that pure engineering could never quite eliminate. Fleet Street, Brook Street, Conduit Street, Bayswater, whose name likely preserves a memory of a bay or spring associated with the old watercourses of the area. Places across London where the surface has been transformed beyond recognition, but where a name chosen centuries ago by people who could see the water it referred to with their own eyes has continued to be spoken by people who have never seen any water at all, and in most cases have no idea the name refers to a river rather than simply being an old and slightly odd piece of London place naming tradition. This is, in its own quiet way, a form of persistence that is worth taking seriously. The rivers themselves were never destroyed, only buried. But their presence in the city's collective memory came far closer to genuine erasure, and it is really only in the past several decades, with the growth of interest in urban exploration, industrial archaeology, and a wider public curiosity about hidden history, that London's lost rivers have re-entered popular awareness at all. Walking tours now follow their buried courses. Books have been written tracing their routes street by street. A river that a Victorian engineer might reasonably have expected to vanish from public consciousness within a generation or two has instead become one of the most reliably fascinating pieces of London's history for a modern audience rediscovering it 2 centuries later. A city built on water, it chose to forget what we are left with at the end of tonight's journey beneath London's streets is a picture that is at once completely explicable and genuinely remarkable. There is no mystery here in the sense of an unexplained phenomenon defying scientific understanding. Every one of London's lost rivers has a known source, a documented history of gradual burial, and a physical continuation today in the form of a specific, mapped, engineered sewer tunnel that a hydrologist could walk you through with confidence. The Fleet is not haunted. The Walbrook is not cursed. The pipe over Sloane Square station is not concealing anything sinister. It is simply a river doing exactly what rivers have always done, in a tunnel built by people who understood precisely what they were building and why. And yet there is something genuinely striking about the fact that one of the largest and most thoroughly documented cities on Earth, a city with 2,000 years of continuous written history, chose deliberately and at enormous engineering expense to erase an entire layer of its own natural landscape from public view and public memory, and very nearly succeeded. Millions of people walk across the buried courses of the Fleet, the Walbrook, the Tyburn, the Effra, and the Westbourne every single day. In a city that prides itself on knowing its own history down to the smallest architectural detail, most of them with absolutely no awareness that flowing water, real, cold, moving water, sourced from springs and rainfall exactly as it always has been, continues beneath their feet in the dark, in brick tunnels built by Victorian engineers, following paths carved by nature millions of years before London was ever founded. The rivers did not disappear when the city built over them. They simply continued, quietly out of sight, doing what water does, indifferent to the streets and buildings and underground stations that grew across their surface, waiting, as water always does, with the kind of patience that does not experience waiting as any particular inconvenience at all. If you're in London tonight, you are almost certainly closer to one of these buried rivers than you realize. Somewhere beneath the street you last walked down in the dark water that has been moving along that same path for longer than anyone can properly reckon is still moving now, exactly as it was moving while you read this, exactly as it will be moving tomorrow, entirely unconcerned with whatever is built above it. You have gone deep enough for tonight. Let the sound of that water, wherever you happen to be listening from, settle into the background now, the way it settles beneath every street in a city that spent 2 centuries trying to forget it was there and never quite managed it. Let the Fleet run on beneath Clerkenwell, patient in its brick tunnel. Let the Walbrook keep moving past the buried temple where Roman soldiers once gathered in secret, beneath the glass towers of the modern financial district that has no idea what lies directly under its foundations. Let the Tyburn continue its quiet, indifferent path beneath the palace, and the Effra beneath the streets of Brixton, and the Westbourne through its iron pipe above the heads of commuters who will never look up and wonder what it is. None of it needs your attention to keep flowing. It managed for millions of years before London existed, and it has managed for 2,000 years since, and it will keep managing long after tonight, long after this video ends, long after every person listening to it has gone quietly, comfortably to sleep. The water does not know it is supposed to be hidden. It simply continues in the dark beneath the city, doing exactly what water has always done. If this helped carry you somewhere calm tonight, there are more stories like it here whenever you need them, drawn from the quiet, buried corners of places that seem, on the surface, to be completely and thoroughly known. And if you feel like sharing where you're listening from tonight, I would like to know. A flat above the old course of the Fleet, a house somewhere the Effra once ran openly through fields, somewhere on the other side of the world where London's hidden rivers feel like a strange and distant curiosity rather than something running directly beneath your own front door. The comments are there, and I do read them whenever you feel ready. But for now, the water is quiet. The brick tunnels hold their old patient darkness. The city above sleeps, mostly unaware of what continues to move beneath it, exactly as it always has. Let that be enough for tonight. Put down whatever is left of the day. Let the rivers keep their old courses in the dark, and let the dark be still and comfortable and yours. From the springs of Hampstead Heath, from the buried course beneath Buckingham Palace, from the iron pipe above a quiet underground platform, from every hidden river still finding its way to the Thames exactly as it always has. Good night. Sleep well.